For today's video, we have gotten our hands on the all-new Volvo XC60. A while ago, we had our first drive review, and I promised you all that we would have a complete review with comparisons just as soon as possible, and that is this video. As we see with other luxury car companies, there is a strong family resemblance between all modern Volvo models. We have the distinctive Thor's hammer headlamp right here that also functions as the turn signal. LED high beams and LED low beams are standard in all models. The model that we're driving is a top-of-the-line inscription trim, so these headlights turn in the corners. We also have a camera right here inside the Volvo logo for the 360-degree camera system, well-integrated parking sensors. You'll notice that we don't have any fog lights on either side. That's not part of Volvo's latest headlamp design. And the other thing you notice that we don't have up front is a radar sensor. That's because Volvo has integrated all of their safety systems into a module that's right here behind the windshield glass. That includes everything that's required for radar adaptive cruise control, pedestrian detection, large animal detection, so this will scan for things like moose out on the road, as well as the lane keeping assistance system. The XC60 also features all of Volvo's latest active safety technologies. Now, not all of these are standard, some of them are optional, but the model that we're driving has absolutely everything. And that includes a full-color heads-up display, Volvo's semi-autonomous driving system, which they're calling Pilot Assist, which will provide almost the entire steering effort required to keep you in your lane at low speeds in stop-and-go traffic, or even most of the effort required to keep you in your lane at higher speeds up to about 80 miles an hour. Now, this is a semi-autonomous driving system, so you do have to keep your hands on the steering wheel, but the car is providing almost all the effort to keep you centered in that lane. It really helps reduce driver fatigue if you're on long highway trips, something like driving from San Francisco to Los Angeles on Interstate 5. We also have Volvo's latest self-parking system, the blind spot monitoring system, and new for this year, the ability for the XC60 to actually steer itself out of the way if it thinks a collision is unavoidable. The steering assist system functions between approximately 31 and 62 miles an hour. It will assist the driver in trying to steer out of the way of an obstacle if it thinks that steering in that direction is a good idea, and it will actually help you out. If you're not doing any steering at all, it will also try and avoid the collision by steering the car out of the way, but it may not be quite as successful as if you're helping the car along. That's in addition, of course, to the runoff road mitigation and all the other safety features that we also see in the Volvo XC90. As with its larger brother, the XC60 has gained a slightly more upright and slightly more rear-wheel drive looking overall profile. You'll notice we have this fairly long hood up front, and the front tire is pushed a little bit further forward than in something like an Acura RDX. That all has to do with the design of the engine bay right under here. That helps give the Volvo a profile that's a little bit closer to the BMW or the Mercedes overall, and a little bit different than the Acura or the brand new Infiniti QX50. The family resemblance between the XC60 and the rest of the Volvo lineup continues out back, where we have tail lamp modules that look like a cross between the S90 sedan and the XC90 crossover. Since we're driving the top-end T8 model, we have a T8 badge right there. We have well-integrated dual exhaust at the bottom. These are actually real dual exhaust, not like what we find in the Audi Q5, where they're faux exhaust tips lower. Back in 2017, there was a Volvo announcement that got some people pretty confused. Some people were thinking that Volvo was going all electric right away, but that's not the case. Volvo has indicated that they have a definite desire to make more electric vehicles, more hybrids, and more plug-in hybrids, but they've also said that gasoline engines are going to be around for a while. And that's why we find 2 gasoline engines and 1 plug-in hybrid under this hood right now. The one thing we do know for certain, however, is that Volvo has said all of their latest vehicles were designed for 4-cylinder or smaller engines only. And that's why all models of the XC60 use a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. If you get the base model, that 2-liter 4-cylinder engine uses a turbocharger to produce 250 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque. Then we get a model that adds on a supercharger for 316 horsepower. And if you want more than that, we get the model we're looking at right here, which adds a hybrid system to the existing supercharger and turbocharger to give you 400 horsepower and 472 pound-feet of torque total. The T5 and T6 engines feature standard all-wheel drive, whereas this T8 features a standard electric all-wheel drive system. That means that this engine under the hood, producing about 313 horsepower all on its own in this form, can send its power only to the front wheels. To power the rear wheels, there is a separate 87 horsepower electric motor that produces about 177 pound-feet of torque. The important thing to remember about this all-wheel drive system is that it can never send more than 87 horsepower to the rear of the vehicle. And that means that under some situations you can still get a little bit of torque steer up front, you can still get a little bit of front-end slip. However, unlike the all-wheel drive systems that we see in Lexus models, there is a mode that you can engage that will send power 50-50 front and rear as calculated by the computer up to a specific speed. And the electric motor in the rear produces a little bit more torque than we see out of some of those other hybrid systems. So that means this all-wheel drive system is more capable than what we see in the MDX hybrid or the Lexus RX or NX hybrid. Because Volvo has said that their future lies in electrification, this is not a regular hybrid like we find in the MDX or RX or NX. This is a plug-in hybrid. And that means that we have a battery in the middle of the vehicle with a capacity just under 11 kilowatt hours, and it's charged via a port right over here on the driver's side. Depending on how you drive the XC60, you could get up to 20 miles electric only, but keep in mind the electric motor is in the back and it only produces 87 horsepower. So 400 total, 87 in the rear axle when in all-wheel drive mode, or 87 in the rear axle when operating as an EV. That means that if you start climbing a hill, it is going to need to turn on the gasoline engine in order to help you up that hill. Seat comfort has long been a Volvo hallmark, but the last generation XC60 felt a little bit behind the times because the seats didn't have the same range of adjustability as many of the competitors. However, that's changed for this model. We now have four-way adjustable lumbar support, extending thigh cushions, inflatable side bolsters, and available seat massage. The model that we're driving has all of those. And therefore, it should be no surprise that these are easily the most comfortable seats in the luxury crossover segment. Now, it is worth noting that we don't have a power tilt telescopic steering column. Volvo still prefers a manually adjusting model. This front seat's adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. I have a generous amount of legroom down there in the footwells, about 3 inches left there behind that front seat, and an awful lot of headroom, about 2 inches or so. Now, it's important to keep in mind that all XC60 models come standard with a moonroof. You cannot get one in the United States without it. That's important to remember when comparing headroom figures between this and the competition on the sidebar, because not all of those competitors have moonroofs in all of their trims. Moving over to the middle seat, you'll notice one of the big differences between the T6 and the T8 versions, because the T8 version has a more pronounced hump and a larger center console. That's because the battery is living right there in the middle of this XC60. And in the T6, we get a shorter center console, so you get a little bit more legroom for that center person, and the hump is not as pronounced. However, headroom is still pretty generous, and if I move all the way over here to the right side of the vehicle, I still have about an inch sitting right here behind this seat. It's moved all the way back in its tracks, and I had a 6'5" person up front. The more rear-wheel drive-like proportions of this generation definitely make the car look sexier, but on the downside, they have a negative impact when it comes to cargo capacity, because we find just under 22 cubic feet back here, which is notably below the new Infiniti QX50. It actually is a little bit smaller than the Audi Q5 as well. We still obviously find more cargo room back here than the average subcompact crossover, but it does mean a slight reduction in the bag score versus some of those larger models. Lifting up the load floor, we don't find a spare tire. This is pretty typical in European vehicles now, but we do find the tanks for the adaptive air suspension system on each side, the 12-volt battery for the car, jack, can Fix-A-Flat, some extra storage, etc. The official tow rating of the XC60 in the United States is 3,500 pounds, but you may see a few things out there that list the tow rating at over 5,000 pounds. That's because the European tow rating comes in right around 5,200 to 5,400 pounds, depending on how it's equipped. Now, substantively, the XC60 does not change between Europe and America. The body, the engine, the transmission, the all-wheel drive system, etc., they're all exactly the same. But how Volvo chooses to rate the vehicle based on market use does change between Europe and America. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in the top-end inscription trim, so obviously things change between this and the Momentum trim, and of course the sportier R-Design trim. The seats in the model that we're driving are sort of a worn baseball glove brown. They feature perforated inserts in the seat bottom and seat back cushion, because again, these are ventilated as well as heated. You can see the extending thigh cushion right there up front, and of course these seats also feature the massage functionality that I mentioned earlier. As you'd expect from a vehicle in the luxury category, the front doors are made from entirely soft touch materials, including a leather-wrapped armrest right there. Because we're driving the fully loaded model, we have laser-cut metal speaker grills, as well as a memory system for the passenger seat as well. Moving over to the dashboard, you'll notice that the design theme is quite similar to the S90 and XC90, with an important change. We have this ribbon of real wood trim that runs from one side, wraps around that air vent, and curves down here around the air vents over here next to the infotainment screen. The air vents are a little bit closer to what we see in the S90 than the XC90, and if we move on over to the dashboard, we see another blend of those two styles with that optional speaker grille right there in the center. Now, our model has the optional leather-stitched dashboard, but a difference between this and the S90 and XC90 is that we don't get stitched leather doors, we just have the stitched leather dashboard. The leather treatment isn't limited to the top of the dashboard, but also includes this section above the wood trim. The section below the wood trim is a soft touch plastic, and then we have a large bin-style glove compartment below that. In the middle of the dashboard, we find Volvo's latest touchscreen infotainment and navigation system. This is basically the same software that we've seen in the XC90 and S90, only now it supports smartphone integration. Right now we're looking at CarPlay right here. A nice touch with the system is that CarPlay interacts in this little window right here, so you still have access to vehicle navigation or your climate controls below that. Below the infotainment screen, we find the only physical buttons that the system uses. We have a hazard light button, dedicated button for the front and rear defogger, track forward, backward, play, pause, and this rotates around for the volume control. Between the front seats, we find more of that open wood trim. These slide open to reveal two large cup holders and a square area that could be used for juice boxes or other large square drinks. We have a 12-volt power port and then a small storage cubby right there above the shifter. The shifter is a joystick style unit unique to the T8 model that we're in right here. We put our foot on the brake and then toggle twice to get to drive, and then twice to get from drive to reverse. It's a little bit different than some of the other joystick units out there. If you want to park the car, we hit the P button. The B mode is a little bit interesting because this is enhanced regenerative braking just like it is in most vehicles. So we click all the way back there to B and we get more aggressive regen braking to help slow you down. But from there we can also continually toggle back and we can actually get dedicated gears out of the 8-speed automatic transmission since this is a plug-in hybrid, not a pure EV. That means that if you're going downhill and B is not giving you enough engine braking, you can keep toggling backwards to get even more. Behind that, we find the engine start-stop toggle. We toggle once to the right to stop the engine, once to the right to start the engine. The drive mode button is fairly self-explanatory. You click it down and then rotate it around to select the drive mode. Continuing back, we find a soft padded center armrest. You can see the heated rear seat controls right there behind it. And this opens to reveal a fairly small storage compartment. And that's because, again, the battery is sitting right here under this, so the compartment does have to shrink a little bit. Because we're driving the top end trim, we have a full LCD instrument cluster as well as a heads-up display. Now, the mode of the tachometer does change a little bit. You'll notice if I put it into pure mode, we don't get a tachometer anymore. We actually get more of a power gauge there. That changes a little bit more depending on the mode that you're in. But you can never expand this map into a more full screen mode like you do see on the Audis. Moving out from there, we have a 3-spoke steering wheel design with sport grips up top and a split bottom spoke. Obviously, with 400 horsepower and 472 pound-feet of torque, acceleration is definitely brisk in this T8 model. We clocked 0 to 60 in 4.9 seconds. That is definitely fast. In fact, if you want to go faster than this, you have very few options. You'll be limited pretty much just to the Porsche Macan Turbo or the Stelvio Quadrifoglio, both models that are going to be significantly more expensive than this. Interestingly enough, this managed the same 0 to 60 time that we clocked in a Mercedes GLC 43 AMG, and this is actually faster than an Audi SQ5. In our repeated testing of the SQ5, we came up just a little bit disappointed by its 0 to 60 time. Now, the key thing to remember with the XC60 is the way those 4.9 seconds 0 to 60 happens, because they're quite different than the GLC 43. The Mercedes, of course, has a strong rear power bias and a really great sounding 3-liter turbo V6. The Volvo system, on the other hand, gives you a large amount of initial torque on the rear axle, about 170 foot-pounds or so and 87 horsepower, but then the rest of the power is coming through the front axle. And that means that if you start pushing this hard in the corners, you can feel it pull just a little bit like a front-wheel biased car. The other thing you need to keep in mind about the T8 system is that it does add a reasonable amount of weight to the XC60, and there's only so much Volvo can do to compensate for that. Now, Volvo has located the weight right here next to me, between the driver's seat and the front passenger seat, so it's in the middle of the vehicle. It's fairly low in the car as well. But it does mean that the curb weight goes up and our stopping distances go up as well. So 60 to 0 happened in 119 feet. That is a little long for this segment. You will definitely stop shorter in a GLC 43 AMG or an Audi SQ5. Now, the other thing you need to keep in mind that I didn't mention in our first drive review is that, like the car we spent our first drive review in, this is a T8 inscription model. This is sort of the luxury-focused high-performance XC60. There is also an R-Design T8. The big difference is that the R-Design has available summer tires, and summer tires would definitely affect the stopping distance. I suspect that this could get closer to what we see in the GLC and the SQ5 if you get that summer tire package, and the GLC 43 AMG and the SQ5 both had those more aggressive tires on it. The tire choice on this XC60 is why I'm going to give this particular model a B+ when compared against the GLC 43 and the SQ5. This handles well, but it does give up a little bit in terms of grip to those other models. Now, don't think that score is bad by any stretch, because this is going to outhandle base versions of the BMW X3, base versions of the Q5, base versions of the GLC, etc., because again, this does have those wide tires. Now, you are going to give up a little bit of overall handling ability if you get the T8 versus the T6, because the curb weight increases. So if you put exactly the same wheels and tires on a T6 model of the XC60 versus the T8, T6 is going to hold the road a little bit better. It'll also hold the road better if you don't get the optional air suspension, because that also adds weight to the car. And of course, the air suspension changes the way the XC60 suspension feels out on the road. It's going to make it feel a little bit softer, a little bit floaty-boaty in comparison. That's pretty normal, of course. Any vehicle out there with an optional adaptive air suspension is going to feel the same way, most notably the Mercedes models that have that as an option. On the bright side, of course, it seriously improves the ride. The off-road mode and the all-wheel drive mode are the biggest differences between this all-wheel drive system and what we see in the MDX, the RX, and the NX, because those systems don't allow any user dictating of how the system is supposed to respond to various inputs. Traction is definitely improved in this system. Now, if I were to floor the XC60 from a stop on this gravel surface, obviously we're going to get some front wheel slip. But the system is deliberately going to limit power to the front axle a little bit and give us the maximum amount of oomph from the rear axle. That's possible because of this large plug-in hybrid battery pack. You can actually get the full 87 horsepower and 177 pound-feet of torque out of this battery pack, and the batteries that we see in the Lexus and Acura hybrids are just too small to deliver the maximum amount of power to the rear wheels without the engine actually creating the power for you. And that's very, very different. In our first drive of the XC60, I mentioned that the cabin seemed a little bit louder than most of the competition. However, once we got this on our own home turf and tested it on the road that we test all of the other vehicles on, we actually got a 70 decibel at 50 mile-an-hour score. That's essentially the same as the main entries in the segment, like the Q5 or the Mercedes-Benz GLC. It is actually a little bit quieter than the BMW X3. Even though this is notably heavier than the Lexus NX hybrid, driving this just as a regular hybrid, we've been averaging 27.5 miles per gallon, which is awfully close to that Lexus NX hybrid number, and we get 200 more horsepower out of this hybrid system. The NX hybrid is designed to be a very fuel-efficient hybrid. This is designed to be a performance hybrid that has fuel efficiency as sort of a secondary mission. Volvo has always marched to a different drummer, and I actually find that kind of refreshing, because a lot of the more recent entries into this compact luxury crossover segment have really been just trying to emulate the BMW X3, which was one of the first compact crossovers in America. Even the new Alfa Romeo Stelvio is going after that very sporting mission. They're just doing it in a slightly different, more Italian way. But that's not what Volvo is doing with the XC60. They're not trying to make an all-out performance machine with this T8 hybrid. They're doing what I said earlier. They're giving you fuel economy that is surprisingly similar to the Lexus NX hybrid, but with the plug-in ability and, of course, those extra 200 horsepower, with 0 to 60 performance that again matches a GLC 43 AMG, which is incredibly impressive. And the vehicle overall is just very, very comfortable, very easy to live with. This is much easier to live with, I think, than the Audi SQ5 or the GLC 43 AMG. The suspension is not punishing. The cabin's also very quiet and very comfortable, and of course, if you live in the state of California, you can drive this in the carpool lane all by yourself, and you can't do that in a GLC 43 or a Porsche Macan Turbo, because this is a plug-in hybrid. And speaking of plug-in hybrid systems, even though this engine does turn on my daily commute, I use a lot less gas if I'm plugging the car in. As you can see, the XC60 comes very well equipped in its base trim. One thing to keep in mind is that the panoramic moonroof is standard, and that does limit rear headroom. Other things worth pointing out that you'll find on the base model are leather upholstery. A lot of manufacturers are actually skipping leather upholstery in the base model and they're giving you imitation leather instead, but real leather is actually standard in the XC60. We also have Volvo's latest city safety system, which includes the autonomous braking with pedestrian detection, large animal detection, and the oncoming traffic detection. Volvo's latest on-call telematics system is also standard, as is an 8-inch LCD instrument cluster that you did not see in this video. That's the smaller one, and of course, the 8.9-inch infotainment screen. Instead of tying feature content to the engine choice, you can actually get the T5, T6, or T8 plug-in hybrid engines with the base trim. And that is a little bit different than some of the competition. For instance, if you were to look at an Audi SQ5 or a Mercedes-Benz GLC 43 AMG, those definitely start an awful lot higher because you have to move on up the feature ladder in order to get the more powerful drivetrain. The simplified pricing structure is one of the things that I really like about the Volvo. If you're looking for one of the best performing vehicles in this segment for the least amount of money, then the T8 plug-in hybrid in that base momentum trim is an excellent option. It will get you from 0 to 60 in 4.9 seconds for about $10,000 less than a GLC 43. The overall styling of the XC60 is also very appealing to me, at least, because the BMW, the Mercedes, and the Audi all tend to be very Germanic. They tend to be a little bit colder in terms of overall feel for me, and the Volvo is a little bit warmer, a little bit more inviting. Now let's move on to the competition. The first and most direct competitor to the Volvo, I think, is the all-new Audi Q5. The Q5 was also completely redesigned very recently. It has a standard 4-cylinder turbocharged engine, standard all-wheel drive, and a standard base price that is identical to the XC60. It's also one of the few vehicles in this segment that has standard leather upholstery. Now, if you look at the surface of things, the Q5 and the XC60 have very similar value propositions. But if you start scratching the surface just a little bit, you'll notice that a lot of the features are a little bit further expanded in the Volvo. For instance, both vehicles offer standard LCDs in the instrument cluster and standard infotainment LCDs, but you'll find bigger displays on the Volvo. Personally, I think the Volvo is more attractive inside and outside. We have those real dual exhausts integrated into the rear bumper, not imitation dual exhausts like we see in the Q5. The Q5 wins when it comes to acceleration thanks to its standard dual-clutch automatic transmission. It helps it be over a half-second faster 0 to 60 than the Volvo, and that's a pretty big difference. When it comes to handling, the two vehicles are very, very similar. The Volvo is a little bit heavier than the Audi, but not by much, and the weight balance is actually quite similar. A lot of people don't realize this, but the average Audi model has a weight balance that's a little bit more similar to a Honda Accord than a BMW 3 Series, for instance. And Volvo's latest designs have actually pushed the engine and the weight further back in the vehicle than ever before. So while we don't have exact weight distribution figures for both vehicles at the moment, I would not be surprised if the Volvo was actually slightly better balanced than the Q5. If we take a look at the XC60 and Q5's larger brothers, the Volvo XC90 actually has a more advantageous weight bias front to rear than the Audi Q7, for instance. Now let's move on to the big seller in the compact crossover segment, the Lexus NX. For 2018, it's received a few tweaks. It's also been renamed, so it's now the NX 300 and the NX 300H. Previously, it was the NX 200T. For 2018, it starts just under $36,000 for the front-wheel drive trim. If you get all-wheel drive, it ends up just under $38,000. Now, why is the Lexus less expensive than the European options? Well, we get less standard content in the NX. For instance, it starts as a front-wheel drive vehicle, not rear-wheel drive or all-wheel drive. It has a 6-speed automatic transmission, and basically everybody else in this segment uses a standard 8-speed automatic. We have imitation leather, not real leather upholstery, smaller LCDs for the infotainment system as well as the instrument cluster. We have 2 fewer speakers, no Apple CarPlay, and a lot less power out of its engine. The Lexus can also get a little bit more expensive than the Volvo depending on how you want to configure it. If you want real leather upholstery in your NX 300, you'll have to pay $45,400. And for that same price, you could buy a Volvo XC60 Inscription that would get you the leather dashboard and some of the other snazzier features in the Volvo that we just don't see offered at all in the Lexus. That moves us along to the Mercedes-Benz GLC, which starts at $40,050 for the rear-wheel drive model. That seems less expensive than the Audi or the Volvo, but remember that the Volvo and the Audi have all-wheel drive standard. So if you add that to the Mercedes, you end up at $42,050, a little bit more than the Volvo and the Audi. You also get a little bit less standard feature content in the Mercedes than in the Audi or the Volvo. The engine lineup in the Mercedes is a little bit different than the XC60 as well. The base model has about the same acceleration as the standard T5 trim of the Volvo, and the next step up from there is actually their plug-in hybrid. They don't stick the plug-in hybrid at the top of the lineup like we see in the XC60. Because of the design and the overall power output of the Mercedes hybrid, 0 to 60 acceleration comes in at 6.2 seconds, so a little bit faster than the T5 version of the Volvo, but not as fast as the T6. At $49,990, the Mercedes plug-in hybrid is less expensive than the Volvo. However, keep in mind that the performance is vastly different. The Volvo is more than 1.3 seconds faster 0 to 60. Speaking of acceleration, there is of course the GLC 43 AMG, which is an absolute blast to drive. Now on the downside, it is $56,000 starting, and that is considerably more expensive than the least expensive T8. The GLC is obviously more dynamic, it sounds better. I actually like the interior better, especially in top-end trims of the GLC than the Volvo. But depending on how you configure it, that GLC could be $10,000 to $15,000 more expensive than the Volvo. And especially at the upper end trims, you won't find the same level of feature content in the Mercedes that you find in the Volvo, like the massaging front seats especially. Now if you want even more power in your GLC, you can step up to the absolutely insane full-on AMG model, but that has no parallel in the Volvo lineup. Really the only things that would compete with that would be a Porsche, or perhaps the Alfa Romeo Stelvio with the quadrifoglio engine. Now let's talk about the newbie, the all-new 2019 Infiniti QX50. We've only had a day in the QX50, we haven't had it for a full week, so do keep that in mind here. But the QX50 is less expensive. It starts at $36,550, so it's down there with the Lexus NX in terms of overall starting price. Now the important thing to remember is that like the NX, we find less standard equipment in that base model than we find in the base Audi or the base Volvo. When it comes to performance, the QX50 gets only one engine. It's Infiniti's all-new variable compression turbo. With a 0 to 60 time of 6.4 seconds, it's in the same realm as the base Volvo model or the base Mercedes model, a little bit slower than the base BMW. Infiniti has really stepped up their game with the new QX50. Interior fit and finish is absolutely excellent, and the quality of the interior is definitely up here with the best models in the compact luxury segment. Value can be a little bit tricky to talk about, but Infiniti is very aggressive with the QX50. Because of the differing ways that options are added to vehicles, it is a little bit difficult to comparably equip an Infiniti and a Volvo, but if you try your hardest, they will end up a little bit close to one another in terms of overall price tags at the bottom of Volvo's ladder. However, as you work your way up the trim ladder in the Volvo lineup, then the Infiniti again becomes less expensive than the Volvo. Especially if you start taking a look at some of the upper end trims of the Volvo, the XC60 will definitely be more expensive than the Infiniti. Now you won't find all the same gadgets and gizmos, luxury trappings, or obviously upper end engine options in the Infiniti, but it will be less expensive than those upper end trims of the Volvo. It's obvious that Volvo was dedicated to making the XC60 a very good value in base trim. It doesn't come across as feeling like a stripped down luxury car because again we still get the leather upholstery, the same infotainment screen that we find in the upper end trims. A lot of manufacturers shrink that down for the base model. We also get the standard panoramic moonroof, standard leather upholstery, standard full LED headlamps, and their latest active safety systems with Volvo's standard telematics system included. So all of that together really makes the base XC60 a really good deal. The XC60 is a very well-rounded vehicle. It's comfortable inside, it has excellent performance, excellent handling, good fuel economy for the segment, and a very well-crafted interior. The big thing about this interior is that the luxury features that we find in the very expensive top-end trim don't feel out of place in the top-end version of the XC60. Whereas sometimes when you take a mainstream vehicle or a lower-end luxury car and you option the snot out of it, some of those luxury features somehow seem a little bit out of place based on the entire feeling that you get from the interior, and we don't see that in the Volvo. And that's why the XC60 is my top pick in this segment. I have to say that the Audi Q5 is my number 2 pick. It is an absolutely excellent vehicle, it's a very good value, but I think the Volvo nudges just ahead of it for me. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Be sure and hit that subscribe button down there at the bottom of the page. Find us over at facebook.com, and if you want to support this channel, and I hope you do, head over to patreon.com and find us over there as well. I'll see you next week.